In a grand gallery in Madrid hang two portraits of the same child. One shows her encased in a lavish red silk dress, a symbol of the court's ultimate luxury. The other, more shocking portrait depicts her in her natural state, presented not as a person, but as a specimen for study. Her name was Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, but history remembers her by the title the royal court gave her, La Monstrua, the monster. Born to a humble family, this child's path led her from a quiet village to the glittering heart of the Spanish Empire, where she became a living exhibit in the royal palace. She was a girl suffering from a rare genetic disorder, yet a supposedly civilized society chose not to see her suffering. They saw only a spectacle. She was surrounded by gold and silk, yet denied the one thing that mattered: her own humanity. For in this story, the most monstrous acts were not committed by the one they called a monster, but by the very people who believed themselves to be the most civilized. This is the story of Eugenia, a girl with a rare genetic disorder whose own society stripped her of her humanity simply because of how she looked. It's incredible to think that the story of a forgotten child from the 17th century can now reach every corner of the modern world. I'd love to know where you're joining us from tonight, so let me know in the comments. This particular story is about how a society can mistake suffering for spectacle and how people who are different are often deeply misunderstood. If you have a thoughtful story or an observation on that theme, feel free to share it below. And how did a child born to a humble family end up as a living exhibit in a royal palace? And how could a supposedly civilized society look at a suffering child and see only a monster? It turns out that being surrounded by gold and silk means nothing when you are denied the most basic thing of all, your own humanity. Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where we discover that sometimes the most monstrous acts aren't committed by monsters, but by the very people who claim to be the most civilized. To understand how a child could be so thoroughly stripped of her humanity, you first have to understand the world that was waiting for her, a world that had perfected the art of dehumanization long before she arrived. Our story takes place in the late 17th century in the Kingdom of Spain. And to put it mildly, things were not going well. The Spanish Empire was like a great gilded warship, once the terror of the seas, now sitting at anchor, its hull silently rusting beneath the waterline. The gold and silver from the New World, the lifeblood of its vast ambitions, had been squandered on endless, pointless wars. The Invincible Armada was a national trauma, a ghost that still haunted the coast. Territories were slipping through its fingers like sand. The economy was a shambles propped up by little more than stubborn pride and the fading memory of a time when the sun never set on its dominions. Spain was a dying lion still possessed of a magnificent roar, but secretly riddled with disease. Its claws dull its strength, a memory. It was a kingdom obsessed with appearances, desperately trying to project an image of divine power and glory, precisely because it knew, deep down, that the power and glory were gone. And on the throne sat a man who, if you are a regular visitor to Cursed Chambers, you are already intimately familiar with. Yes, we are back with the Spanish Habsburgs. I know. I feel like I've spent more time analyzing this family's genetic misfortunes than their own court physicians did, and I've made at least 2 videos that dive deep into this particular brand of royal disaster. But you simply cannot grasp the sheer weirdness of this court without understanding the man at its center, King Charles II. History calls him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. For those new to our little tour through historical train wrecks, let's do the lightning round recap. The Habsburgs, in their obsessive quest to keep power and wealth locked down, practiced so much strategic inbreeding that their family tree began to look less like a tree and more like a decorative wreath. They played a multi-generational game of genetic roulette, and with Charles the Ball, finally landed on 00. He was less a monarch and more a walking, breathing cautionary tale against marrying your first cousin. History calls him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. For those new to our little tour through historical train wrecks, let's do the lightning round recap. The Habsburgs, in their obsessive quest to keep power and wealth locked down, practiced so much strategic inbreeding that their family tree began to look less like a tree and more like a decorative wreath. They played a multi-generational game of genetic roulette, and with Charles, the ball finally landed on 00. He was less a monarch and more a walking, breathing cautionary tale against marrying your first cousin. Now the specifics of the king's health were of course a state secret whispered about behind perfumed fans, but the general picture was one of perpetual illness and profound fragility. And naturally, he possessed the signature family heirloom, the Habsburg jaw, a feature so prominent it made the simple act of eating dinner look like a complex geopolitical negotiation. To the common folk who lacked a working knowledge of recessive genes, the only logical explanation was sorcery. The king was cursed, a living symbol of the kingdom's sins, and they were in their own way absolutely right. He was cursed not by a witch's spell, but by his own pedigree. Imagine being this man, a king in title but a prisoner in reality. A prisoner of his own frail body, of the suffocating court etiquette that dictated his every move, and of the immense weight of a failing empire. He was a deeply lonely, deeply sad, and deeply superstitious man, ruling over a court that mirrored his own condition. It was a world where priests held more power than generals, where relics and omens were given more weight than economic reports. And it was a world that desperately searched for distractions. This brings us to the most important of this world's rules of the game. In the 17th century, a condition like Eugenia's wasn't a medical problem to be treated, it was a pre-existing condition on a spiritual level. And frankly, given the cost of an ambulance ride in America today, perhaps trusting in God's will was the more affordable insurance plan. This desperation for divine signs and earthly distractions created a very specific and very cruel social ecosystem centered around the hombre de place, the people of pleasure. This was the delicate courtly term for the entourage of jesters, dwarfs, and other individuals with striking physical differences who were actively collected by the Spanish monarchy. They were living curiosities collected and displayed with the same pride as a rare painting. Their function was threefold: to be a status symbol, to serve as a dark psychological prop for the insecure nobility, and most importantly, to be a spectacle. In a court starved for meaning, spectacle was everything. This was the world that awaited our protagonist, Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, a young girl with a condition we now recognize as Prader-Willi syndrome. Her antagonist was not one single person, but an entire system. The true enemy was the relentless, dehumanizing gaze of the court. And the man tasked with documenting this cruel spectacle, our key supporting figure, was the great court painter Juan Carreño de Miranda. His paintings, as we will see, would unintentionally become the most permanent indictment of the court's inhumanity. The stage was set, the cage was built, and beautifully gilded. All it needed was a new spectacular specimen to place inside. And soon, a rumor would begin to drift from the countryside, a rumor of a child so impossibly large, so wondrously strange that she could not be ignored. The greatest collector in Spain was about to hear of the one item he knew he had to possess. Our story, or rather Eugenia's story, begins properly in 1674 in the small, unassuming village of Bárcenas in northern Spain. This was a world away from the gilded rot of Madrid. It was a place of stone houses, of simple faith, of seasons and harvests, a world that operated on a human scale. It was here to a humble couple named Antonio and Antonia that Eugenia Martínez Vallejo was born. For the first few months, there was likely nothing to suggest her life would be anything other than ordinary. But then things began to change. The child grew, and grew, and grew. She grew with an alarming, almost supernatural speed. This wasn't the healthy chubbiness of a baby. It was something else entirely. She was possessed of an appetite that could challenge a small platoon, a bottomless, aching hunger that no amount of food could seem to satisfy. Her parents, likely a mix of baffled, terrified, and overwhelmed, could only watch as their daughter expanded before their very eyes. By the age of 1, she reportedly weighed as much as a 10-year-old. By 6, she was a local phenomenon. In a small village, a secret like that doesn't stay secret for long. The whispers started first spreading from neighbor to neighbor. The story would have been told over hearths and in the local church. Was she blessed? Was she a glutton? Was she some kind of omen, a sign of a bountiful harvest or a coming famine? The local priest would have heard the stories, and he would have reported them to his bishop. From the bishop, the word would have traveled up the chain of command, the story growing more fantastical with each telling. A large child became a giantess. A strange appetite became a demonic hunger. By the time the rumor reached the whisper-filled halls of the court in Madrid, it was no longer the story of a girl with a strange affliction. It was the story of a living marvel, a monster of nature, a must-have item for any collector of the bazaar. And as we know, the king was the greatest collector of them all. And so the summons arrived. It would not have been a polite invitation. It was a royal command wrapped in the language of a great honor, an offer her family, simple farmers, could not possibly refuse. We can only imagine the scene: a 6-year-old child, already set apart by her size, now being formally taken from the only home she had ever known. She was placed in a carriage destined for the capital. She was no longer a daughter, she was now a royal asset. The prodigy from the provinces was on her way to the gilded cage. The journey to Madrid would have been an assault on the senses, but nothing could have prepared a child from a rural village for the reality of the royal Alcázar. It was a labyrinth of stone and tapestries, of suffocating perfume and unwashed bodies, a noisy, bustling hive of intrigue, ambition, and crushing boredom. Upon her arrival, Eugenia was presented to the court. Imagine it, this small child pushed into a grand hall filled with the most powerful people in Spain. The music would have stopped. All eyes would have turned. The nobles, dressed in their severe black silks, would have stared, their faces a mixture of feigned piety and undisguised ravenous curiosity. The whispers, the pointing, the cold, analytical gazes. This was her welcome. It was not a greeting, it was an appraisal. And so began her new life, a life of bizarre and cruel paradoxes. The first part of the paradox was the luxury. She was given the wardrobe of a princess. She was draped in velvets and silks adorned with ribbons and even jewels. But these clothes were not designed to make her look beautiful or even to fit her comfortably. They were designed to accentuate her size, to make her even more of a spectacle. She was being dressed up as a caricature of a noblewoman, a living, breathing joke on the court's own fashions. The second and more tragic part of the paradox was the food. In a palace famed for its banquets, Eugenia was given access to an endless supply of the richest, sweetest, most decadent foods imaginable. For a child, with what we now know was an uncontrollable pathological hunger, this was not kindness. This was torment. They were with what they probably thought were the best of intentions, methodically feeding her disease. It was the 17th century equivalent of trying to put out a house fire with a flamethrower. Day by day, she was made larger, more spectacular, a more valuable part of the king's collection. This was the gilded part of her cage. The cage part was the soul-crushing emptiness of her existence. She received no education. She was taught no skills. She had no duties, no purpose save one to be seen. Her days were spent in a state of managed idleness. She would be required to stand for hours in antechambers, a silent, breathing statue. She would be brought out at parties, a conversation piece for jaded aristocrats. We can assume she was lonely, isolated from children her own age, surrounded only by adults who saw her not as a person, but as a pet. Imagine the sheer mind-numbing boredom of it all. Her life was an endless loop of being dressed, being fed, and being stared at. She had been acquired, she had been displayed, and now, for an object of such rarity, there was only one thing left to do. The prized possession had to be immortalized. Enter Juan Carreño de Miranda. At this time, he was the official court painter to the king, one of the great masters of the Spanish Baroque school. Carreño's job was to paint the truth of the court as he saw it. He painted the king not as a powerful, idealized monarch, but as the sad, haunted man he truly was. His portraits were unflinching, almost clinical in their honesty. He was less a propagandist and more of a coroner conducting autopsies on canvas. And now this unblinking artistic eye was turned upon the court's newest and strangest acquisition, Eugenia. We must remember that sitting for a portrait in the 17th century was not a quick or pleasant affair. It meant holding a pose for hours on end, day after day, in stiff, uncomfortable clothes. For any child, it would be a form of torture. For a child like Eugenia, likely with developmental challenges and physical discomfort, it must have been an ordeal. The first portrait he painted is the one you see most often, Eugenia in the red dress. It is a masterpiece of psychological cruelty. She is posed formally holding a piece of folded cloth, just as a noble lady would hold a fan or a glove. The dress is a cascade of expensive red silk and silver embroidery, a costume so lavish it almost swallows her. But it's a performance, and a failed one. She is not a noble woman. The dress is a lie. She is a child playing a part she does not understand for an audience that is laughing at her. Carreño has painted a doll a proper thing. And then came the second portrait, the one that stripped away all pretense and with it, all dignity. Now, for reasons that I'm sure you can appreciate, if you want this channel to continue existing, I will not be showing the full painting here. But I will say this, if you feel so inclined, I encourage you to look it up yourself. Just once. Go to Google and search for Eugenia Martínez Vallejo. The image you will find is clinical. It's stark, and it's central to understanding what was truly done to this child. What you will find is the final undeniable proof of her status in the court. Because in that painting, she isn't a goddess or a nymph or any other mythological figure used to dignify the nude form. She is simply there, presented to the viewer with the same dispassionate neutrality one might use to document a strange new species of plant. It feels less like a work of art and more like an illustration from a medical textbook. A textbook that hadn't even been written yet. It confirmed what the court truly believed: she was not a person. She was a body, a collection of flesh to be measured, examined, and recorded. Carreño's brush captured her form with chilling, undeniable accuracy. He recorded the truth of her physical existence. But his paintings, for all their detail, left the most important question unanswered. What was truly going on inside this child? What was the real nature of the monster the court believed they had captured? To answer that, we have to leave the artist's studio and enter the modern laboratory. The story of what happened to Eugenia is over. We have followed her from her rural village to the heart of the Spanish court, and we have left her immortalized on canvas, an eternal prisoner of the royal collection. But now the most important part of our journey begins. We leave the narrative behind and step into the examination room. We must now investigate why it happened. Let's put on our forensic gloves. This is a historical autopsy, but the body on the table is not Eugenia's. It is the idea of Eugenia, the myth of La Monstrua, that the 17th century constructed around her. Our task is to dissect this myth, to peel back its layers of superstition and fear, and to determine the precise cause of death for this child's humanity. Before we can reveal the truth, we must first understand the fiction, the neat, tidy, and terribly convenient story the court told itself. To the people of the 17th century, Eugenia was not a medical case. She was a philosophical puzzle, a walking, breathing marvel that demanded an explanation. And in a world without genetics, they found explanations in the only places they knew how to look: faith, superstition, and spectacle. First, they saw her as an omen. In a kingdom obsessed with its own decay, ruled by a king widely believed to be cursed, any deviation from the natural order was a sign from God. But what was it a sign of? Some argued she was a symbol of hope. Her magnificent size, a promise that Spain itself could one day be great again. Others more pessimistically saw her as a monstrous reflection of the state's own sickness, a grotesque echo of the king's own cursed condition. This ambiguity only made her more fascinating, a divine riddle to be debated by priests and nobles. Second, they saw her as a theological curiosity. The Church, the ultimate authority on all matters, would have struggled to place her. Was she a test of faith? Was she proof of God's limitless and sometimes strange creative power? Or was she something outside the bounds of normal creation, a creature that existed in a gray area between human and something else? She wasn't just a girl, she was a living thesis, a subject for debate on the very nature of God's plan. And finally, and most simply, they saw her as entertainment. This was perhaps the most dehumanizing explanation of all. It neatly solved the puzzle of her existence by giving her a purpose. Her role, her God-given function, was to be a spectacle. Her purpose was to amuse, to shock, and to distract the court from its own anxieties. In this view, she wasn't a person with a condition, her condition was her personhood. That was her entire reason for being. This was the story they told themselves. It was a complete, self-contained, and tragically fundamentally wrong explanation for the young girl in their midst. To find the truth, we don't need a 17th century priest or a court philosopher. We need a 21st century geneticist. Let's enter the first part of our modern investigation, Exhibit A, the medical file. The truth of Eugenia's condition has a name. It's called Prader-Willi syndrome. It is a rare, complex genetic disorder that was not identified until the 1950s, almost 300 years after Eugenia lived. And when you look at the symptoms, it is as if you are reading a direct biography of her life. The first and most defining symptom is a condition called hyperphagia. This is a constant, insatiable, and agonizing hunger. The part of the brain that tells a person they are full simply does not work. Sufferers feel like they are perpetually starving no matter how much they eat. Suddenly, Eugenia's monstrous appetite is not a moral failing or a sign of gluttony. It is a source of profound, chronic suffering, a neurological prison from which she could never escape. The syndrome also causes hypotonia or low muscle tone, which can lead to a certain lethargy. It causes the rapid weight gain and obesity that so defined her appearance. And crucially, it is almost always accompanied by some degree of intellectual disability or developmental delay. This explains why she was treated as a perpetual child, unable to advocate for herself or articulate her own experience. Looking at Carreño's portraits today, you can even see the distinct facial characteristics associated with the syndrome: the almond-shaped eyes, the downturned mouth. Every single aspect of the monster they described can be explained point by point by this diagnosis. She wasn't a monster, she was a patient. A child with a complex, definable genetic disorder. A condition that today would come with a diagnosis, a multidisciplinary support plan, and let's be honest, a lifetime of battling with your insurance company to get any of it covered. But in 17th century Spain, the only coverage she received was on a canvas. So now that we know what her condition was, we must ask the next question. Why did the court react the way it did? Why did they choose to see a monster where there was only a patient? For that, we turn to Exhibit B, the psychology of the gaze. To understand the court's reaction, we have to look back to the man at the center of it all, King Charles II. His entire life was defined by his own physical otherness. He was a king who ruled a world that prized perfection. The walls of his palace were covered in masterpieces by Velázquez and Rubens' images of idealized beauty, strength, and nobility. But the reflection he saw in the mirror was the opposite of that ideal. So what do you do when you are the monster at the top of the food chain? You collect lesser monsters. By surrounding himself with people like Eugenia, Charles could exert control over the very concept of physical difference. He couldn't cure his own ailments, but he could possess, clothe, and display others who were also outside the norm. It was a dark psychological coping mechanism. By owning the spectacle of others, he could perhaps distract from the spectacle of himself. And the court, a universe of sycophants, followed his lead. If the king was fascinated, they would be fascinated. If the king saw a marvel, they would see a marvel. They praised Eugenia's uniqueness because they were in fact praising the king's taste in collecting her. Her dehumanization was a performance of their loyalty. So we have our cause of death for Eugenia's humanity. The weapon wasn't a dagger or a vial of poison. The weapon was ignorance wielded by fear and insecurity. They didn't see a person because, frankly, they couldn't afford to. To see her as a suffering child would be to acknowledge that the universe was not a set of divine signs, but a place of random, tragic biological chance. It would be to acknowledge that the body, even a royal body, is fragile and fallible, and that reveals the true nature of this story's cursed chamber. It was never a physical room in the Alcázar palace. It was the human mind in a pre-scientific age. It was a mindset locked in a prison of its own, making a prison of superstition and fear. It was a fear of the unknown, a fear of the different, and perhaps most profoundly, a fear of seeing their own fragility, their own mortality reflected in the eyes of a suffering child. They called her La Monstrua, not because of what she was, but because of what they were unwilling to see both in her and in themselves. They stripped her of her humanity, and in its place they created a timeless, tragic image. But what happens to such an image when its creators are long dead? What is the legacy of a crime that was never seen as a crime in the first place? That is the final haunting echo we must now explore. And so the historical autopsy is complete. We have examined the evidence, we have dismantled the myth, and the findings are clear. Let us close the case file with a final verdict. Eugenia Martínez Vallejo was not a divine omen, nor a supernatural monster. She was a human child afflicted with a rare and tragic genetic condition who had the profound misfortune of being born in an age that had the tools to exploit her, but not the knowledge to understand her, or the compassion to help her. The court that captured her saw a spectacle. We, with the clarity of hindsight, see a patient. The great crime committed against her was not one of malice, but one of a deeper, more chilling indifference, a failure to see the person behind the prodigy. But what happened after the paint on her famous portraits had dried? What became of the girl once the novelty, as all novelties do, began to fade? The historical record, much like the court itself, begins to grow quiet about her. And this second act of her life is in many ways a second tragedy. For a time, she was the star of the court, the most fascinating curiosity in the king's collection. But courts are fickle, and the hunger for new distractions is relentless. As Eugenia grew from a strange child into a strange young woman, the gazes of the courtiers likely moved on to newer, more amusing spectacles. The ultimate cruelty wasn't just that they stared at her, but that eventually they stopped. She lived out the remainder of her days within the palace walls. A ghost in the machine, a familiar fixture whose strangeness had become mundane. She faded into the background of the court's daily life, a living relic of a fascination that had passed. She died in 1699 at the age of just 25. It was the year before her King Charles II would also die, taking the entire Spanish Habsburg dynasty with him into the grave. It is a fitting tragic symmetry. Her life, which had served as a strange mirror to the king's own condition, ended right as his own pathetic reign was finally sputtering out. Her story was bookended by two kinds of inhumanity: the intense obsessive curiosity of her childhood and the quiet dismissive indifference of her early adulthood. It is difficult to say which is worse. A person dies, but an image can be eternal. The true ripple effect of Eugenia's story, the echo that has allowed us to tell her tale today, comes from the very tools of her objectification, the paintings. We are left with the question of the artist Juan Carreño de Miranda. What did he think as he painted this child for hours on end? Was he merely a cold functionary, a man carrying out a royal commission with dispassionate skill? Or can we detect in the careful rendering of her sad almond-shaped eyes a flicker of sympathy? Did he, in those long, quiet hours in the studio, see the lonely child behind the myth he was tasked with creating? We will never know. But the intent of the artist almost no longer matters, because the paintings have outlived their original purpose in the most spectacular way. They were created for a tiny elite audience of Spanish nobles, a private spectacle to be viewed in a royal hall. They were meant to say, "Look at this strange and monstrous thing our king possesses." Today, thanks to museums and the internet, they are viewed by millions around the globe. And we, the modern audience, look at them with a completely different gaze. We do not see a monster. We see the symptoms of Prader-Willi syndrome. We do not feel wonder or revulsion. We feel a profound, aching pity. We see a lonely child in a ridiculous dress who deserved better. The paintings have become her revenge. They were meant to be her cage, but they have become her testimony. They hang now in the Prado Museum, silent witnesses in a trial that has been going on for over 3 centuries. They draw us in with their Baroque splendor, and then they confront us with their human tragedy. They force us to ask the questions the Spanish court never would. And in doing so, they have transformed from royal property into a universal lesson on empathy. They were meant to display a monster, but instead they expose the monstrosity of the world that created them. And this brings us to the final human insight. What does the story of a forgotten girl from the 17th century teach us about ourselves? It teaches us about the nature of the word monster. A monster is rarely a thing that actually exists. It is a label. It is a story we tell ourselves about someone who is different, because that story is easier than the complex, messy truth. The monster is a mirror. When the court of Charles II looked at Eugenia and called her La Monstrua, they weren't describing her. They were describing the reflection of their own deepest anxieties, their ignorance of medicine, their fear of the divine, their terror of physical imperfection. And this is where we must turn that mirror upon ourselves. It is easy to judge the ignorance of a long-dead court, but how much truly has changed? We no longer use words like monster to describe those with genetic conditions. Our language is more polite, our science is more advanced. But the fundamental human impulse to stare, to judge, to quietly form opinions based on physical appearance, to otherize those who do not fit our narrow definitions of normal, has that really gone away? How do we today treat those with visible and invisible disabilities? How do we react to bodies that challenge our expectations? Eugenia's story forces us to ask these uncomfortable questions. It holds up a 300-year-old painting and dares us to see our own modern biases reflected in its dark age varnish. Eugenia's life is a brutal lesson in the nature of power and the convenience of labels. It shows how easily a person can be turned into a story, and how that story can become more powerful, more real in the minds of others than the person themselves. She was a footnote in a pathetic king's biography, but she has become a headline in our modern conversation about empathy and human dignity. And perhaps that is the ultimate tragic irony of her cursed chamber. She had to be seen as a monster for centuries before we could finally learn to see her as a human being. What do you think of Eugenia's story and the legacy of her portraits? Let us know your thoughtful reflections in the comments below. And if you wish to unlock more of history's cursed chambers and re-examine the stories we think we know, be sure to subscribe. The past is always waiting.